This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Shannon Sauer-Zavala. Welcome to the Phantom Electric Ghost podcast. How are you doing tonight or this
I'm
morning?
doing I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you. I want to let people know we are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. You can see that icon up there. It says listen on Newsly. And for those of you who haven't tried that, you can use the coupon code of GHOST and try that for 1 month free. We are, again, a featured podcast on that platform. If you use coupon code GHOST, you can check that out today. Later today, we'll be on Newsly. We're actually at episode 1050 with this episode. Tracking that on Apple Podcasts since 2016. And we do have your link here that will be fully clickable, the bpdcompass.com/general-8. That will be clickable, so you don't have to worry about remembering that, but it will be up. And then today we're going to focus on how to nudge your personality to achieve goals and improve your mental health. So again, welcome to the Phantom Electric Ghost podcast, and hope everybody is having a good morning. So one of the first things we like to ask our guests is why do you do what you do, and what motivates you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the reasons I was really excited to come on this podcast was the fact that you interview creative people. And I think that, in my profession as a clinical psychologist and like really academic researcher, right? Like it's not particularly creative and the writing I do is really academic. But when I was deciding whether or not to go to graduate school for clinical psychology, I was also considering going to graduate school for an MFA in creative writing. And so I do sort of see myself as sort of a creative in an academic landscape.
Mhm.
And over the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, I've been focused on writing treatment workbooks for patients. And of course, like that's much more creative. It's much more personable with examples and really written for a lay audience. And so I kind of think about treatment development as this really nice intersection of like science and academics and also the ability to be creative. So I was really excited to come and talk a little bit about that. And yeah, as you mentioned, here recently, my research and my clinical work has been focused on helping people nudge their personality traits to improve their mental health. And one of the reasons I'm really passionate about that is because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about personality, right? That you're born with your personality, that it can't be changed. But personality,
Mhm.
by definition, is like kind of a summary label that describes your typical way of thinking and behaving. And like we change how we think about things and we change how we behave all the time. And so if we change those things and we maintain those changes over time, then we've changed our personalities. And there's such a robust research literature on the mental health risks associated with certain personality traits. It's really worth people considering that you could sort of shift those risk factors so that you're kind of in better shape generally. And then the last thing I'll add is that like I see personality change in my own life, right? Like I am a formerly lazy person, formerly really shy. And, now I am kind of an inbox zero sort of person. I have a monogrammed planner and, I get up in front of hundreds of people and do public speaking. So that's like me kind of rambling on about all the reasons I'm passionate about what I do.
Yeah, well, we've been talking to a lot of different people over time, and we started to include therapists and life coaches and people who talk about people's wellness. And what I found is people can kind of remap their brains. They like 'cause if you can find out like you might have been growing up with like limiting beliefs,
Hmm.
and you think that's like a truth. But
Yeah,
because somebody told you weren't good enough, and so you
right,
kept on thinking that you couldn't do something, and then finally you have some kind of catalyst, and you realize, well, that's not the truth, and you don't
right.
have to be confined by these kind of like your own glass ceiling. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of times creative people they run into traps where they're into like comparison trap, they're into like I'm not good enough. They have a lot of limiting beliefs, even though they'll be on stages and they seem outwardly like very, you know, uh, uh, you know, they seem like they belong there, but a lot of
Mhm.
times they don't believe they belong there.
Right.
And so, like, when you're working with an artist, like, as a producer, you find that a lot of times there's like, "Wow, this person is not what their mask makes them appear to be."
Yeah, fair enough. Mhm.
So they like it's kind of like something you find, and as I think everybody has like their own limitations in terms of like what they're comfortable with, and
Mhm.
then you realize like you can't be perfect, and you're never gonna get to like 0 to 100. It's something that's incremental, but I think a lot of times we have such a fast food type of mentality.
Mhm.
Everybody wants the like 12 steps, 18 steps, like a
Right.
immediate answer. I'm gonna go right to 0 to 100. And so when you're dealing with people like with that kind of situation today, where everybody's being influenced by these influencers, and they're like AI generated, they're kind of fake, and they think that's
Right.
the paradigm, and they don't realize like your actual personality with all of its so-called imperfections is like really is like that's you, and that's like there's nobody else like that. So you should kind of not be putting yourself down as much as people
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and you kind of mentioned, like, in your sort of a theme of talking to therapists or coaches, that sometimes there's this catalyst for a big change, and that can be true, right? Like, life events are sort of a really important kind of jumpstart for important change. But I also think that, like, the catalyst can be you, right? And so one of the things that I like to work on with people is this kind of notion of, instead of taking a personality test and staying in your lane, right? Like, I mean, lots of us have taken personality tests probably in high school that told us you'd be a great dentist, or, taken personality tests that, like, you're stubborn and that's the way that you're going to be in your relationship. So you should find somebody that is more flexible. Those are examples of personality tests to kind of like stay in your lane. And I think that we can really do the opposite, right? So we can sort of think about what is our goal, right? Like, what types of relationships do we want to have? What types of career opportunities do we want to have? And then kind of imagine what personality traits would increase the likelihood of success, and then think about taking intentional actions that would nudge your own personality traits over time.
Yeah, because that idea of nudging is interesting to me because I think a lot of times like people are given this kind of roadmap, like, oh, you got to go to college, you got to get a
Mhm.
career, you got to be in a box. And being a creative person, what we tend to do is we think about the bell curve. We're on the both sides of that
Right.
curve, and a lot of times, like in the corporate world, they say they want a creative person, but they tend to want the people that are in the middle of that bell curve that stay in the cubicle. And then they
Mhm.
wonder why they don't get the creative. Like, because Einstein was getting D's. So if you
Right.
measured him, the measurement wasn't correctly assessing who he was. And a
Mhm.
lot of times with artists, like SATs and tests, they don't measure their capability of artists or creatives. And so the world has these measures that don't actually apply to certain types of people.
Right.
And then those types of people are discouraged from doing it because that's foo-foo, that's not realistic. You need to have a solid career. So
Right.
it's kind of hard from the start to be authentic because they want you to like be non-authentic.
Right. Yeah, 100%, right? And then, thinking about, like, you're not extroverted, so you would never be able to promote your work. So, like, why try? Or you are maybe higher in neuroticism, which is our personality trait that indicates the tendency to experience negative emotions in response to stress. Um so maybe you get really anxious when you are faced with a deadline, or you have to get up in front of people and really sell your work, right? Or promote. Um, and I think, like, when we take these personality tests and we sort of assume, when you hear the word personality, that that's static, that, right, you're totally right, that could help. I mean, that could puts us in our own head, so that that we're like, well, why bother? And I do think that people are inclined to take the path of least resistance, right? And so change is really hard, right? Like to be less anxious, getting up and promoting yourself, to become
Mhm.
more extroverted, at least in the situations where you need to bring it on. Um, like that's pushing you outside of your comfort zone, and that's challenging. And so I think like there's comfort in getting this label and kind of using it to explain why you shouldn't try.
Mhm.
But that's not really like backed by science. Science says that our personality traits can and do change over time, and that we can speed the process up by taking these intentional actions.
Yeah, I think that's really important because a lot of times it's like if you have people who are neurodivergent and then they're kind of told
Mhm.
like, well, you can't be part of society because society wants you to kind of be in the office.
Right.
But during COVID, people were able to get, a lot of neurodivergent people were able to like kind of shine because like, oh, I can do this online and I can, but now
Mhm.
they're like being forced to like, oh, you got to go back to work.
Right.
Well, I'm able to do it. We were shown that I could do it, right? So
Mhm.
why do I have to fit in the box? Because some CEO says I got to fit in the box, and it's kind of counterintuitive because they're saying they want these type of people, but then they don't encourage those type of people, or they put roadblocks up for people who are like in the American Disabilities Act, and they don't want to pay
Yeah.
attention to it, right? They don't want. It's like, oh no, everybody's got to be in the queue. Everybody's
Mhm.
got to have this criteria, and so it seems like it's very contradictory, in society because they're building these norms, and then
Mhm.
people don't fit the norm, and they're saying, well, we're inclusive, and then you find out like, well, they're not so inclusive. They really still have these biases that maybe they don't even know they have these biases.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's super true. I think about like, so my husband is a musician and had, kind of a designer. He is trained as an architect, and for a long time he worked in event design, and it was sort of like he's kind of like a cubicle creativity. And I think that, he was actually laid off during COVID. And we've talked a lot about how he probably wouldn't have taken the leap to start his own architectural design business because, the, it's just like the status quo is just easier to maintain, right? And that with that push, like you kind of had to, he's now living much more in line with his values. And, we can see, I mean, you can see his creativity really blossom and
Mhm.
his like mood and happiness, right? Because that he's
Yeah,
doing what he
you get more
values.
aligned. You get
Right.
more aligned with what you want. A lot of
Right.
times people are on a path that people expect them to be on, like their parents, the
Hmm.
society, the corporation, the rules.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's like, you don't get a lot of progress if you just stay within the lines. And I've always been like a creative person trying to do like both side, left side, right side.
Hmm.
I'm a
Yeah.
musician and I'm a software designer. What I
Right.
find is a lot of people don't realize, well, that's totally different things. Music has a lot of math in it.
Hmm.
Music has tons of mathematical models. I'm a synthesist. So
Yeah.
I design sounds from waveforms. And
Hmm.
waveforms go through all these processors like oscillators and
Yeah.
envelope generators, and it's very logical, but it's very creative because like
Hmm.
someday you can kind of know what a square wave's going to do, but if you invert it and you run it through filters, it will do different things that maybe you didn't expect. And so it's kind
Right.
of like what you hear is what you get, and it's kind of this kind of flow state. Throw it at the wall, let the muse kind of not confine you, and sometimes you're willing to go with the happy accident rather
Yeah.
than the planned event. And a
Hmm.
lot of times with creative people, our gut will tell us to go, yeah, I had a plan, I wrote it on the bars, and then I
Hmm.
came up with something that totally deviated from what I wanted, and it was better. And I go
Right.
with it rather than thinking what I wrote down was better. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of people is like they want to stay on the plan, even if
Mhm.
there's something, the moment suggests that maybe you shouldn't stay on plan.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I get that. I think that applies to like academic research, which is definitely more stick to the plan, and there are ways we do things. And I think like, kind of feeling like a creative person at heart, right? I think that that can be a real strength because it helps to see Well, maybe we haven't looked at it this way, or maybe if we do, if we ask participants to do X, Y, and Z, it'll answer the question in a different way. We'll be able to look at the problem from a different perspective.
Yeah, like in school, I was a sociology political science major,
Mhm.
and it was all about in political science how you asked the question when you did the
Yeah.
poll, and
Right.
you
Oh,
could kind of predict what you're going to get based on how you ask the questions. I had all my professors would say, like, yeah, if I ask the question this way, I'm going to get this type of response. So I can kind of pre kind of level set this and get what I want. But if I'm
mhm.
more open and I think about alternatives or different options, or I kind of think out like all the way to the end. If I ask this, what kind of responses would I get
Right.
logically? And so if I want to kind of have a real open-minded point of view rather than narrow point of view, I'm gonna ask the questions that would tend to get these results,
Mhm.
or more open-ended questions so I get different results.
Right.
And so a lot of times people say, well, that's the truth.
Mhm.
It depends on how you kind of massage the truth.
Right. Exactly.
And I think some people just feel things like, well, everything's black and white, and a lot of times there's a lot of gray. There's a
Mhm.
lot of things that are kind of like not in the lane. Like,
Right.
as a musician, we play with genres, right? So
Mhm.
I could mix jazz with punk, right?
Right.
So I have a punk aesthetic, which is more raw, with a
Mhm.
jazz kind of discipline to like
Yeah.
be, somebody that actually knows the scales, they know the rules. But
Right, right.
if they have the punk aesthetic, they're gonna mix both and you get something
Mhm.
different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
right. Oh,
yeah,
go
it's
ahead.
just a different mindset.
Yeah, it makes me think about like, Picasso and abstract art, right? Where it's like you kind of have to know the rules to break them. And it's sort of the synthesis in the middle that is like where real creativity or real action happens. And I think that the same, when you mentioned like, kind of the gray, right? Instead of the black and the white, that made me think about something that comes up in therapy all the time. I'm constantly challenging my clients to think about the gray, to live in the gray, which is super uncomfortable because it's so much easier to tell yourself, that person is a jerk, right? Like, then to kind of accept that or kind of consider in the gray that it sort of takes two, it takes two to tango.
Yeah.
Or, and people that I treat really oscillate between it's the other person's entire fault or, oh my gosh, I'm terrible.
Mhm.
And really
It's
it's kind of in the middle, right? And so when we think about like intentional personality change, yeah, like I think people are like, well, I'm introverted or I'm extroverted, right? And it's like,
there's
well,
no middle.
yeah,
There's a little
you
bit
can
of
be in the
everything
middle or it can be situation to situation, right? Like you may be the
situational,
type of
yeah.
person that likes or needs their quiet time or alone time to sort of recharge, but you might be able to, even if you haven't done it before, you might be able to, if you push yourself, learn to turn on that particular trait in situations that warrant it. And thinking about artists, right? um you have to be able to promote if you're wanting like that kind of exposure or
Experience.
recognition, right? I mean, I talk about this with my husband all the time because he's a musician, and sort of the like, if a song is recorded in a forest and no one's around to hear it, like, is still the
Noise.
process enjoyable? And kind of going back and forth of like, he's really driven to create this music, and like, he wants people to listen to it.
Yeah. It's kinda like the creative drive. There's a point of time where you're also like, you're in your lab. I'm in my bedroom studio around all my synths. Like, a lot of artists was like, "Well, I wanna stay in this womb kinda
Mhm.
bedroom,
Yeah.
producers, my studio." But there's a point where, like, you gotta bring that out of the studio to the public. And a
Mhm.
lot of times it depends on whether you're a good marketer. If you think about a guy like William Blake, one of the great romantic poets, he wasn't a very good marketer. Nobody knew him during a romantic period. But
Mhm.
he took his art, his poems, and he etched them in acid on metal plates. And so they were found after he was gone. So he had the kind of forethought. I'm not just going to put these on paper. I'm going to put these in
Mhm.
etch, make them like
Yeah.
eternal. So he wasn't the greatest marketer in his time, but because he went and did that, he became one of the greatest romantic poets, but he wasn't known in his time.
Right.
So it's still you want to bring a little bit of that to the present, right? It's like
Mhm.
you have to promote. Like he thought about like this idea, we'll put them in metal, and they were found, but they weren't found in his time.
Right.
So that, so that's you do have to put time into like promotion, or nobody's gonna know you.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think another personality trait that's probably relevant for creatives, and may be something that, like, creatives maybe I mean, this is a generalization, obviously, but don't think of as, like, their vein is sort of, like, conscientiousness and planfulness, right? Because, the biggest predictor of success in one's kind of chosen path is how diligent and conscientious you are, how able you are to persevere in the face of setbacks. And
Mm,
that's the personality trait of conscientiousness, kind of on a continuum with disinhibition, right? Where it's like I'm kind of just like stuff happens and I'm kind of pulled in different directions. And conscientiousness is actually one of the easier personality traits to change. I mean, I
mm,
can think about, like I said, like I'm formerly lazy person and now am like successful academic. And, when I was younger, I sort of had these beliefs that what I did really didn't matter. And I think some of that is based on, being kind of a first generation college student, being like not coming from a family with a lot of money,
mm.
kind of thinking like, I don't know, like didn't really necessarily have big dreams, and how I had this like little moment, like I can't actually pinpoint like a big, like earth changing, earth shaking
Catalyst, like,
moment that shifted my personality. It wasn't like a lightning strike, but it was like a ton of little changes over time, right? So when I was in
mhm,
my freshman year of college, and like meanwhile, I'm like mostly I'm skipping a lot of my classes and just sleeping in and kind of just flitting around. But I found psychology really interesting, and like made it to that class. And we took these tests, sort of like every couple weeks, multiple choice tests. And most people did really not well on them. They were like famous for being really hard. And I did well. And I remember the TA, like going to pick up my test score. You had to like go check in with the TA saying like, you should really consider majoring in psychology. And like that moment, I was
yeah,
like, yeah,
yeah,
okay.
me too.
And I started to see myself as somebody that was good at psychology, right? So I still wasn't necessarily performing very well in my other classes, but if I was a psychology class, I was studying really hard. I was making flashcards, which kind of like ages me. And I was performing really well and helping others, studying with others. And so that kind of continued until like maybe the end of my sophomore year. And I was like, I think I want to go to graduate school for psychology. I'm good at it and I really like it. And I really like interacting with people. So like I think I would be a good therapist. And it became clear based on my overall GPA that I was not going to get into graduate school. And that was really upsetting, right? And so
Yeah,
something that can happen, right? Like when basically like I think about, this is another sort of psychology thing. I think about like principles of reinforcement, right? So when something good happens and you get rewarded, it makes the behavior more likely, right? So was rewarded for studying for that test by what the TA said, and that I kept getting rewarded, so I kept doing it. Another form of reinforcement that's really important is negative reinforcement. It's like taking away something that feels bad, right? And so it felt bad to kind of get the feedback, yeah, you're not really that competitive for graduate school. I did not want to feel that way. I felt guilty and I felt upset. And, over time, I was able to, I was like, that sort of lit a fire under me. Like, I have to
yeah.
start really performing in my
Get
other
the
classes.
discipline to get the
Yeah,
other, to get where you want to go. Like you want to be a surgeon, but you got to pass biochem. You got
right,
to be able to do the chemistry. You got to be able to do the math. You got to be able to. So you might, be really good at certain aspects of it, but you got to build up.
right,
And it's kind of like, I think it's like athletics. Like if you first show up and you try and get the 3-point shot, you're not hitting it
right.
until you do it like 1,000 times, then you hit it. Like in
Mhm,
the end of that 1,000, like by the time you get to the last, 30% of that, you're probably hitting it all the time.
right,
It's just that with the beginning, you're not. And I think when you're a musician, right, you practice. Like first, you don't get the piece, you don't get it, you don't get the skills.
Mhm.
But if you show up,
Right.
if you don't skip, if you actually get involved, you start what was hard becomes like muscle memory.
Right, right,
And
and
so,
that's exactly, I think,
yeah,
for creatives, right, that idea of practicing and getting really good at your craft, take that template and apply it to, like, intentional personality change because it's basically the same thing.
yeah, that's why I try to like a lot of times creatives were kind of put into it's like, oh, you guys are foo foo, you guys
Mhm,
are childish, you got childlike, and like, well, how can you go and have the audacity to do these things? Well, there's a certain level of discipline
mhm,
in whether you're a painter, an
right,
actor, a musician, like all the different form photographer. There's a discipline to like learn the aspects of your, and it just is what the same level of stuff that it takes to become a mathematician, a physicist, a scientist, a doctor. It's the same thing.
right,
And so when you find something that you're good at, whether it's athletics or philosophy or whatever, like the discipline involved is like across the board. And
mhm,
that's where I think you can learn lessons from one thing to the next. And
yeah,
everybody always wants to stay in one lane, but some
mhm,
capabilities can be shared
right,
across many lanes. And then you can get to be more of like that, the kind of jack of all trades. Like you can start to learn. You needed to build up to be able to go to graduate school.
mhm,
If you're gonna be an artist, you gotta have a stage presence.
right,
You could be great at playing, but you keep your back to the audience and you have no character.
right,
No one's gonna wanna see you.
right,
They wanna hear you, so maybe you could be a studio
mhm,
musician, but if your goal is to be the stage musician,
star,
then you need to bring a little Lady Gaga, a little Prince, a little Michael Jackson. You gotta learn how to
right.
you gotta have to amp it up. And a lot of these people, if you looked at them, like Prince was shy, unbelievably shy. Michael Jackson was unbelievably shy. Bowie, before he got into his theatrics, he didn't have that stage presence.
Mhm,
So that was learned. That was
right,
practiced.
yeah,
It wasn't just natural. People just think it's like, oh, 0 to 100 just happened. It's like
right, or you're
never
born
just
that way.
yeah, it never just happens.
Right,
Usually there's a level of effort
yeah,
that's ignored.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah,
So, I mean, in terms of like we're talking about the nudging, the
mhm,
personality. You talk about it's not always like that crucible catalyst moment. Sometimes
yeah,
it's kind of like if you're on a diet, right? If the fad diet doesn't work, right? What works is something that you're gonna do for the next 30 years,
mhm,
the rest of your life. Like so,
right,
when you start to learn intentional things that are actually sustainable, then you can actually make progress. Because if it's something that's so hard or something that you're never really gonna do, you're only gonna, stay in that for whatever length of time that you can kind of manage it. And usually it's not gonna last.
yeah, yeah, and I think about that, like, I mean, right, like, being able to do things that are manageable that will stick, and being able to do things that are possible right now, right? So, like, if I have a goal, to be like a keynote speaker and talk in front of a lot of people, but I only have ever communicated my sort of like academic research through journal articles, then, booking a keynote speaking gig in front of thousands of people is like going to be really anxiety provoking. And I mean, probably not logistically possible, but if we imagined that it was, that's going to be really scary. That's a big jump, right? So, like, what are small manageable steps that will probably go well and capitalize on those principles of reinforcement, right? So, like, how can you do something that is going to get a reward, and the reward can be as simple as just like pride, like I did that, or it could
Mhm.
be, I don't know, I'm trying to be like timely, it could be likes or shares,
Yeah.
kind of thinking about what thinking about your end of the road goal and then kind of backing it up a little bit and thinking about, well, what can I do today that will push me a little bit, put me outside my comfort zone a little bit, but like I can do it. And then when that gets reinforced, then you think, what's the next thing I can do that will push me a little bit? And that's where I think we get into this idea of like an upward spiral, right? We think about downward spirals. And,
Mhm.
I think people have started to talk about upward spirals a little bit more. And that's that idea that, like, it's like a funnel, right? It's narrow at the bottom because you're making tiny changes, but then they build off of each other and, kind of manifest over time.
Yeah, the how to actually manifest and actually get to like actualize is kind of like you dream it, but you don't just keep it in your head. You start to practice those
Mhm.
things. You start to like as an artist, if you I've been around artists like you got all the paintings in your loft.
Mhm.
And then you have somebody said, "Well, these are brilliant." It's like, "Well, you have a gallery show?" "No, I'm not ready."
Right.
Well, it's like that mindset that you're not ready. It's like, what's the first step for every musician that shows up like in a pizza bar and does the first show there, right? It does it in at the the talent show. Well, you
Yeah,
got to
like the
show
open.
up, right? And so
Mhm.
so you over time you show up, your lessons learned from your mistakes. Right?
Right.
You can't expect, like you said, to go in front of 1,000 people and not make a mistake. Right? You're
Right.
gonna make all artists, we make our mistakes, and in kind of those like in public mistakes, they can be lessons learned.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
if you
and
don't
thinking about it as
take it,
a way to reinforce.
yeah, if you don't take it as like that's the end of the world because you bombed. Like
Mhm.
every comic has a joke that bombs, and it's
Right.
how they recover from the bomb that keeps them
Right.
going. It's kind of
Yeah.
like that riffing. There's like, oh, that bomb that
Mhm.
didn't work, so like
Right.
adjust it. It's that's kind of like the talent.
Right. It's like that idea of information gathering based on, how certain, kind of bits performed. And like, I think that, kind of going back to that personality trait of, um, neuroticism, right? The tendency to experience negative emotions and kind of negative thinking, right? Like, I mean, I think about giving feedback and, sometimes you can give somebody like 90% positive feedback and then give them one piece of constructive criticism and they will really just like hone in on that tiny piece, right? And it's a skill, right? It's a
Yeah,
personality kind of orientation towards the negative thing or the positive thing. And that
yeah,
too is something that if you made the decision to, you could shift over time, to focus more on like, well, it was 90% positive, so I'm feeling actually pretty good about it. And I can work on this other thing, as opposed to like, I am never gonna make it.
yeah. What's the kind of trigger? Learn how to handle your triggers. Because
Right.
like if you're the kind of person somebody cuts you off, there's a lot of people like you're driving is like that's not going to cause road rage, right?
Mhm.
But there's a certain person if it will cause the road rage,
Right.
and if they start to recognize like that kind of slight is so important to them that it gets them out of the car, gets them into that kind of things. Like, well, how do you start to realize you have that tendency and learn how to make a different choice, right?
Yeah.
Learn it's like, yeah, I shouldn't go from a 0 to 100 and get out the car and
Right.
wanna get into the fight, right? It's like I start thinking like, well, that's not the biggest slight in the world, right?
Right.
Like, how do you start to, like, turn that mountain back to a molehill? Like, it's not it's like that 1% criticism now has got you red-faced and
Mhm.
you're freaking out. It's
Yeah.
like, how do you start to learn your triggers and
Mhm.
start to, like, come up with a plan on how
Yeah.
to, like, deal.
Yeah, and I think that you're describing therapy skill, right? Which is like know your triggers, right? Because if you want to make a different choice and change your behavior and change your thinking patterns, right? Like i.e. change your personality, you have to be aware of what your triggers are that kind of bring out the personality traits that you are trying to change. So, talking about road rage, that's the personality trait of agreeableness versus antagonism, right? And so, people fit along that spectrum, and there's no like right or wrong place to be necessarily. Like we think being more agreeable is a good thing, and in general it is, right? Like we're more likely to have satisfying relationships. However, too far agreeable and you are probably really compliant and really kind of subjugate your own needs so that
Like
you can
people
help
pleaser.
other people, and that doesn't
Yeah,
really work either.
you become like a people pleaser, and then you
Right.
think like you're always people pleasing, but you're not. It's like not really effective,
Yeah.
and you think you're helping people, but you're really not. Because if you're subjugating yourself, your own interest to everybody's interest, you're probably getting resentful,
Right. Yeah.
right? And you probably have other triggers,
Right.
And if people don't even realize they're going to trigger it because you got this people pleaser thing and you don't really
Yeah.
do what you want. And then you never have time for your own things because you're doing everybody else's thing.
Right, and it's, like, adaptive to have, like, a little touch of the antagonism because that's how you are like, "Hey, like, when you said that, it wasn't okay." Or when you did that, it wasn't okay, right? Or here's what I need. And I think that people that are too far on the agreeable side of things think that like asking for what you need is selfish, right? And then
Mm,
people that are really far on the other side, the antagonism side, are like, this is my road. I can't believe that person cut me off, right? And kind of
mhm.
have that rage is easier, right? And so both could really learn from each other, right? Like kind of meeting somewhere in the middle and how do you nudge? And so I think you're right, like being aware of your triggers so that like I know, my antagonism shows when I'm cut off in traffic. So I have a plan for how I'm going to try to behave differently. So I don't start screaming at the person. Maybe I decide that I turn up my radio or I put on a podcast or something. And when nothing bad happens as a function of doing a different behavior, we learn, right? We learn, oh, the anger
Yeah.
goes away on its own. I don't have to curse out my window. It just comes down naturally on its own. And then that's reinforcing. So then we might be inclined to behave similarly going forward.
Yeah. If you don't have to win every argument, like,
Right.
that you can learn. Like if your mindset isn't such that where you're not able to learn because you have these like significant beliefs, like so even if somebody gives you something that's like a scientific fact, like you don't believe it because you've been
Mhm.
kind of put into this conditioning where like
Right.
I only believe X. Anything other
Mhm.
than X is like blasphemy. Like so
Yeah.
I can't even get out of it. And we see a
Mhm.
lot of people today are on such like very tight mindsets
Yeah.
that they've been told X and X is the only truth.
Mhm.
And there's like no getting out of it. Right.
Right.
You can show them facts and then they don't believe the facts.
Yeah. I mean, and
And
that's a lot
you
of
could be snowing, they say it's not. So it's like, what is that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think like beliefs and behavior change as a function of experience, right? And like data. And so if you haven't been exposed to a ton or you're sort of like in an echo chamber where like you aren't challenged at all, somebody telling you, right, over a Thanksgiving dinner table perhaps that maybe they should consider a different political belief or, you know, anything or something else. That that's going to go in one ear and out the other. It's not going to create any change, right? But we're all, I guess, like kind of individual scientists, kind of collecting data on our own lives and our own experiences. And so, if kind of have this sort of hypothesis that the world is one way and you decide that you maybe want to be more open to other ideas, you might engage in a behavior that tests that hypothesis, right? Like if I think that I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a not that controversial thing that I
Yeah,
think. If I think that people are going to laugh at me if I give a talk, right? Like
yeah,
I'm going to keep that. A belief is not going to change, right? Like you could
mhm,
tell me that that's not going to happen, but like I won't believe you until I get up there and do it and see for myself, right? I confirm my hypothesis or I disprove it. And so I think like that's where that intentional change comes. I also think, right, and anyone that's ever been in a relationship with anybody knows that you can't make somebody change, right? Like that has to be internal. Like you
mhm,
can't. There has to be that intention or that desire internally, right? And so I do think that like kind of going back to the idea that like we get our personality tests and we're like, okay, like I can't do that, so I might as well not try, right? Like people are comfortable staying in their belief systems because challenging that pushes a boundary, right? And it's the same thing for like exchange of ideas. So it's effort to consider that the world is gray and that people that like maybe hold a different political affiliation than me or people that hold a different religious background than me, that like they might have a point. Like that gray
yeah.
is hard to think about. So that you can change, right? But you have to have that intrinsic motivation to do it.
It's also like when you think about society today with people having issues like even communicating, like dating. Like, everybody's using
Yeah.
like apps
Mhm.
because they don't feel safe. So they want to
Yeah.
use an app. They want to have a filter. And so if
Right.
they actually meet somebody in real life, right, and somebody they have a connection
Mhm.
and they actually start to feel like, well, I could talk to this person, then they sound like, wow, like there's a fear. Well, I
Yeah.
didn't get this person validated through the app. I didn't get them background check. So I, even though this feeling seems like there's a connection, it's like I'm going to stay away from it because it's too dangerous. So
Yeah.
then there's like this kind of like isolationism we're creating because
Mhm.
like, oh, the only correct way is through this validated app or
Right.
through this conversation. So then we're losing some like communication skills because like we say, well, this is the right way,
Mhm.
and this other way is too dangerous. And it could be, but it's like it's like how do we make like judgments that aren't so like absolute?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things, I mean, I actually talk about with my patients about dating a lot because it's something that's really important to a lot of people and it's something that's really anxiety provoking. So, I definitely hear you around like the filters, right? And like the curated dating profile. And you could think about that with any social media, right? Where it's like maybe it's not a dating profile, but it's like your Instagram or your Facebook. We're not really presenting all of us there. It's a very
Yeah,
curated thing. And I mean, that seems fine on the surface, but and maybe like in the terms of a dating profile, the curated profile attracts more people at first, but it can actually increase anxiety. It can backfire because they don't know the real you, right? And so it's like you created this curated thing and then there's like this pressure to keep that up, right? And so
yeah.
I'm always kind of telling people like, you should be yourself because wouldn't you rather find out sooner that you're not
Later.
compatible than
Yeah,
than attract people that you're not compatible with based on like, your sort of like public persona?
yeah. With this idealized vision, it's kind of like, are you gonna be vulnerable? Like as an artist,
Yeah.
we have choices. Like I can clone the top 20 artists and
Hmm.
try to match them because I'm a musician and I can figure out how to totally match the rhythm,
Right.
the sound, whatever. Even their affectations, I could totally just clone them
Yeah.
and get the same response on an algorithm, try to mimic so I get the same kind of result. I'm in the same zone. But it's harder to be vulnerable and be my own
Hmm.
self and put something out that's initially not going to get the likes, not going to get the views, is
Hmm.
going to speak to something that might not be what's popular.
Right.
But was more authentic, and over time, if I keep on presenting that, I'm gonna build an audience. It's just
Hmm.
gonna take longer. It's gonna
Right.
be harder. It's easier to kinda jump the line and just copy or
Hmm.
present something that's not authentic. So
Right.
I think people are scared of, like, the vulnerability of presenting the actual real real artist or real person.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you could take that into sort of like therapy change as well, right? Because expressing a desire to change is a vulnerability, right? Like it's admitting that, maybe some things aren't working and that like then sort of like puts you in this position where you have to work hard to make the change, right? And that's a huge vulnerability. Um, I think you kind of mentioned this too, right? That you could, in sort of like the creative sphere, you could sort of like fabricate or authentic, kind of copy or clone, kind of styles of what's popular, and that could build, sort of fan base more quickly. Um, and I think that, like, we do sort of live in a society that isn't particularly patient. And so I think, like, that's another pressure to do that versus, like, wanting to be more authentic, to be your vulnerable self, to take the time to connect with the people that, like, are like-minded or that appreciate you for you. And at the end of the day, you will feel better about yourself if you're kinda living it all out there and people still like you.
Yeah. Well, because if you show up, you know, on those stages as that authentic self, you think the idea like a Bob Dylan.
Mhm.
Bob Dylan initially presented himself as like an Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie clone. He actually sounded like them.
Mhm.
He had songs that were totally like clone. They were like exactly like that. Then he came up with this nasal kind of his own style. It was totally different than what he had been kind of aping. He was like doing this other thing.
Right.
And then he added electric, and then people said, "Well, you're a Judas." It's like he showed up at the jazz festival, and he had this electric band, and he had that nasal voice, and people, "What's that?" And then it became critically acclaimed. The critics
Right.
started saying, "This stuff is like listen to the lyrics,
Mhm.
listen to what he's doing. It's not what had been done." He suddenly became like this amalgamation of everything he had kind of took from the
Right.
old folk people, but then he mixed a bunch of other things, and then he found his voice, and that's what actually hit.
Right.
And initially, it was like critically, people were yelling at him. Like in England, they were like throwing stuff at him, telling me he's terrible. And it's like, but he kept on going into it and perfecting it and getting better. And then eventually, the critics, he got allies by
Mhm.
by by sticking to it. And I think that's what's hard, because it's hard to kind of stick to your guns and actually stay authentic when there's
Yeah.
a pressure like to go along, get along,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's like you said, it's vulnerable and it takes time. And, I think the Bob Dylan example is a really good, I mean, it's just a good example of change is uncomfortable internally and it's uncomfortable externally too, right? So if you decide like you are going to be a little bit more assertive, right? That's your goal. Well, people in your family or your friends who are used to you just always saying yes when they ask you to help them move, there's going to be pushback, right? And so, I mean, that's what happened to Bob Dylan, right? When he got up and played with an electric guitar and it's kind of a different affectation. People, I mean, I think I've heard the story that he was like booed
Yeah, he
at
would boo, people were
yeah.
yelling like Judas. There was
Yeah.
and then he actually said, it's on tape, "I don't believe you." Like, Dylan act and he kept on going. He didn't end the set. Some people would just end the set, they were booing really heavy. I've got the audio of it. It's a famous
That's
concert. It's
crazy.
actually on they actually have it released with the boos,
But yeah.
and people yelling and saying they hated it. And, there's even a documentary of people saying that he's like the worst musician in the world and
Oh
they hate
man.
him, and they were going off. But he just like he said, "I don't believe you," which was, like, really radical for an artist, like, on stage to say, "I don't believe what you're saying about me. I'm gonna keep on going."
Right.
And that to me was, like, as an artist, like Lou Reed, he was the kinda guy that did
Mhm.
stuff like that too. He just kept on going with what his
Yeah.
style was, which basically was spoken word poetry.
Mhm.
And then from '66 to '70, nobody liked it. And then he did Walk on the Wild Side, and Bowie kinda gave him some backing, and then boom, suddenly what everybody said was terrible was somehow now the greatest thing in the world.
Right.
But from '66 to '70, he kept that at it. He kept and nobody liked him except other producers.
Mhm.
And it's really kind of like you're living in the problem today is like a lot of times like does the world even give you that kind of space that a Lou Reed could go from '66 to '70
Right.
and be supported to be able to continue to '72 to again end up working with Bowie? You're
Mhm.
wondering, like, I don't know, because people are so into instant gratification and instant satisfaction, they would they even give the time
Yeah.
to allow a Lou Reed to happen or a Bob
Mhm.
Dylan to happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's really hard, and that's something that I've talked a lot about, like, with my husband, just about music, right? And that a lot of I mean, I feel like I'm pretty stuck in my listening to, like, late '90s, early 2000s indie rock, because for me, a lot of, like, the newer stuff sounds the same, and I think it's this phenomenon that you're talking about. It's like this recipe or this formula, and that, like, people are less willing to take risks because of, like, all the online streaming. There's so much more, like, choice, I guess.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah,
like, there isn't I mean, I remember going to the record store when I was, with like $20 and I could buy 1 CD. And so it's like you have to sit with it. Like you make a choice based on one song you heard on the radio, and then you have to sit with it and learn and like it and like evolve with it and grow with it. And that really isn't happening now. I don't think in
yeah.
the
We
same way.
also have this kind of thing in arts where there used to be these radio stations that were independent, and the
Mhm.
DJs could go pick whatever locally was happening. And so they would go listen to the clubs and find the new acts. But now you've got these kind of corporations making one guy responsible for a whole region. One guy. So
Wow.
one guy gets their taste, and it's kind of very narrow. Compared to I saw this documentary where this DJ was like lamenting that the reason that the diversity is not there in what we hear is because you don't have you did have gatekeepers, but you had gatekeepers that can make choices about, yeah, I should like Chuck Berry's cool, Little
Mhm.
Richard's cool. That this
Right.
band from Detroit is cool. This Detroit sound is cool. It's like, well, now you're not getting a Detroit sound or a Chicago sound or a Boston sound. It's like it's a whole 50 state strategy because this one guy controls the whole market. And you're like, what? Like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
But because the bean counter said that's more
Right.
efficient. But when it comes to the arts, like things aren't efficient.
Right.
Like
That's not
that's the
plugged
problem. Like
in.
you try to put efficiency into the arts, is like then you get like no choice because like it doesn't logically make sense sometimes.
Right.
And that's the thing is like personalities. They think about people is like we're not always gonna fit in the box.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
if
and
you
then we
try to
might get
say that the
pushback.
box is the standard bearer is the box, and it's like, well, okay, what are you gonna get?
Yeah, and then kind of considering, I think, kind of going back to that example of somebody that's been, like, pretty agreeable, pretty, like, always shows up to help friends move even at, like, personal cost to themselves, right? Like, that person, that's the box that they're in, and if they make a decision to change that, there's gonna be pushback, right? Because the system was working for the other people around them, right? And so being willing to really hone in on what's important to you, what your values are, at the end of the day, how you wanna feel about yourself, and making those changes, even if there is, some pushback from the system.
Yeah. Well, I think today, like what you have to do is try to just present without the mask on, which is
Mhm.
hard
Yeah.
because like society is always gonna have you have a certain stage, we call it like stage presence. Like if
Mhm.
I'm with my family, like that's who they see. If I'm
Right.
with my boss, that's who they see. If I'm
Mhm.
a, this person, and this is what they see. We kind of put on it automatically,
Right.
and maybe we need to get more aware of what we're actually putting on. So
Mhm.
I think when you start to do the self assessment, it's like, well, how I present to my wife is different than how I present to this person, how I present to that person. And you
Right.
start to like kind of dive into like, why are you doing that? And I don't know if people take the time until they go into therapy as like, why are you presenting this way? Is
Yeah.
that what you do when you get into therapy to kind of dive into like, why are you presenting these different versions of yourself?
Yeah, right. I mean, yes. So we all do this to some degree, right? Like the way that you interact with your boss or your professor. Like obviously there's going to be differences than how you interact with your partner or with your kids. And that's
Mhm.
natural and normal, right? So I think in therapy, what we look at is to see if these kind of changing selves is causing problems for you in the long term. So you one of the kind of like disorder groups that I kind of specialize in is called borderline personality disorder. And one of the symptoms of BPD is you being different with different people. And then kind of the second part of that clause is so you don't really know who the real you is. And so
Mhm.
that's an example of like it's not like a college student changing their major once or twice. It's not, kind of being a little bit more familiar with your wife than you are with your boss, right? It's like really, when I hang out with these people, I have these things. And then I started to hang out with this other group and now I'm going to be vegan. And oh, now I'm with this other group. So I'm going to do something different so
Mhm.
that you don't really know what's important to you and what your values are. And yeah, right. Like I think that's something that we really examine. So I usually at the beginning of therapy talk about people's values with them. We have a list of 11 different kind of domains for values. So like what you want to be like as a partner, what you want to be like as like an adult child or brother or sister, what you want to be like as a parent, a friend, like what are your values about career, what are your values about personal growth, and so on. And we really spend a lot of time at the beginning, at least when people work with me, figuring out what's important to the person. And like values are different than goals, right? Like values are sort of life directions, and just like you can't ever arrive at west, you never get there. You never get to like being an honest person. It's not like you're like, oh, I was honest once, like check. It's like the way that you're going. And goals kind of can fit along the value. And so we talk about the difference between values and goals. And then we really spend a lot of time going through each of these domains and, I kind of helping or providing scaffolding for the patient to identify what their values are. And the reason we do that is because I don't want to assume that there's a one size fits all right personality or right way to be or right behaviors, right? It's like what you value and how can we shift your traits? How can we shift your behaviors and your thoughts so that you can get closer to your values?
That's a really important thing because I think there's a lot of people who probably think there is some kind of standard
Yeah.
like self. And that's
Right.
part of the problem. Like everybody's thinking they gotta be this standard kind of human being. This is the right human being. Like human
Right.
beings have so many different like aspects. Like that's part of your personality is the unique, variation. That's the to me is like, and people try to get away from the variation and think it's not right because but I think it's like that the kind of learning to like live with it and like it and love it. I think that's
Yeah.
a lot of problems. There's a lot of times people, oh, that's selfish to love myself. Well, if you don't love yourself, there's gonna be a lot of things that kind of cascade from that.
Right.
So if you think that's like foo-foo, that I don't need to do that, I just need to find my soulmate and they're gonna fix me.
Right.
Like, well, you're probably not gonna get fixed because you didn't solve the root cause.
Right. And you're not going to find the right person if you aren't living in accordance with your values, right? Like you got to like get yourself right first. Otherwise, like we talk about this a lot in therapy where, if you don't respect yourself, you're going to behave in certain ways that attract people that don't respect you, right? And like
Mhm.
a prerequisite for being in a healthy relationship is being in a healthy relationship with yourself first.
Yeah, it's like a law of attraction. Like
Mhm.
you're gonna keep on getting into codependency if you kind of have that tendency. You're gonna attract codependency until you realize that that's a problem, and
Right.
it's not gonna get solved by the next person because the next person is probably gonna be the same person you've been running into all the time.
Right.
And it's like there's really like look in the looking glass, like the poets used to focus on the looking glass self. And
Mhm.
why? Because that's where all the stories are. Like
Right.
that's where the whole call. I mean, all songwriters kind of get into the looking glass self. That's like where we start, and
Mhm.
then we look at other things. But it's kind of that dive is our catharsis, and why we write is to dive into that
Mhm.
and pull out what we can, and that's what feels authentic when we hit it, and then people hear that chord. They hear like, wow, that's something I feel because we kind of hit the central theme
Yeah.
that people can understand. And it's kind of that empathy that we try to tap into. We try to
Mhm.
tap into these kind of universal concepts. It's like, if I put this out there, I mean, you're going to interpret it however you do, but you're going to feel something because I'm kind of tapping into that frequency
Right.
and there's an understanding. And that's like the more that it resonates, then we've actually hit it right. That we actually hit the
Yeah.
chord. And that's what we're trying to do. That's how you actually connect with the audience. Is that you start to understand that.
Yeah. I mean, we actually have an exercise in that we do in therapy where we ask people to pick a personally relevant song that they think will bring up strong emotions for them. And we do kind of a mindfulness exercise where we listen to the song and we just notice everything that's coming up, all the emotions that are coming up. And so, I mean, I think that you make a really good point. And I think like that there is this sort of like relationship between art and kind of like self-improvement or therapy or personality change, in that it's really validating to kind of hear your sort of inner monologue that maybe you don't show to a lot of people echoed in like such a public way, like in a piece of art. And I think that that gives people some um just some more like confidence to express some
Yeah,
of that
to dive
themselves.
into it. Yeah, 'cause a lot of people's favorite song will kinda dive into it, and then maybe they might get into therapy because they're kinda exploring, something, Joni Mitchell said,
Yeah,
something
exactly.
that, you know Carole King said,
Mhm.
it's like your tapestry. I was listening to Tapestry, and I echoed to something in my own relationship, and then I need to dive into it. And it's kinda like, well, it's like the songwriters are kinda that's what their goal is. They have that kinda connection. They can see that commonality with all human beings. They're gonna feel that whether you're a woman or a man or whatever, you feel these emotions. You
Mhm.
wanna tap into it and get people to say it's okay. It's not foo-foo
Right.
to get melancholy or get happy or to get, whatever feeling you're gonna trigger.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to actually have happen. But, I want to thank you again for being on the show. It always goes by quicker than we ever think.
Yeah.
We actually hit the hour, and I do want to remind people they can click on the link below, the bdpcompass.com, and that will be fully clickable. So you won't have to remember about like trying to remember that, but it will be on all the platforms. We're on all the major podcast platforms where you can listen to or watch podcasts, and we will be on there later today. We've been on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. And I want to thank you again for being a guest on the Fam Lecticos podcast.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. This has been awesome.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.